Hey, good afternoon everyone. Welcome to Focus Physio Feature Friday today. So we've had a request asking about, from an endurance coach, asking about lower back pain with regards to endurance athletes during activities such as the rower, biking and running. So what we're going to look at a few things today on some things to check, and the main thing we want to check is the hips with regards to lower back pain. Now if you've seen a post that we put recently talking about lower back pain, the lower back is not usually the problem. The problem usually arises from up top, be it the trunk, or lower down, be it the hips. For the purposes of today, we're just going to talk about hips being the problem, or something to check about, something to check for with regards to lower back pain in endurance events. All right. So the first thing we're going to do is to check the hips. So a few different movements, and we're going to talk through it. So first thing we want to do is to check how much hip flexion you have. So I get Buddy to lie on the ground. So for hip flexion, what we want to check, bend both knees up, is that we want to have, we say 120 degrees of hip flexion. Alright, so we want the knees to be relatively close to the chest. When we bring the knees to the chest, we want to make sure that the hips are not coming up too much, which is a problem when if you're restricted in your hip flexion or you're stiff in your hips, you run out of room, bang, that's where the lower back comes into play. Alright, so that's a problem, that's something we want to check with regards to hip flexion, the mobility problems in hip flexion. The second thing we want to check for is what we call the Faber's position. It's almost like a figure 4 position. Alright, looking at how the hip sits, we want the knee to be 2 fist length away from the floor, so that's good. Looking at how that sits compared to looking at how this sits as well, we want some form of symmetry. Alright, so what we said before, hip flexion, if you're stiff in your hip flexion, it's going to put more pressure into your lower back. If you're stiff in this test, it means that you don't have hip extension. Alright, if you don't have hip extension, when you're running, your pelvis is going to dump forwards. The last test we're going to look at is called straight leg raise. So lie on your back, knee straight, lift this leg up to the ceiling. So looking at how far he gets through here, back down, switch sides, looking at how far he gets on the other side, and back down. So we should have an appreciable amount of symmetry between both sides, because that cyclic motion, if one side is freer compared to the other side, he's going to be running not symmetrically, alright? He's going to be running unevenly, not very balanced in terms of loading through the legs, through the hips, pelvis, and in turn the spine as well. So how do we apply this with the endurance activities? So let's go to the rower first of all. So a while ago, or a couple weeks ago, we did this blog and this video about how important the hips are in regards to rowing as well. So in that pull motion, so pull and come back in. Now, if you've got no movement in your hips, like what we showed you before, lying back down, he's going to dump and come more through his lower back. So he's going to be putting more pressure on his lower back rather than letting the hips absorb through the movement. Alright, so pull again. The hips come in, he can still keep a nice straight back rather than being closed off at the hips and thus having to round forward at the lower back. Alright, so that's for rowing. Now on to biking then. Cool. So in that position it's okay, but in a lot of the aerodynamic type positions, if you're blocked in the hip, once again, it's going to put pressure on the lower back. Rather than having appreciable free range of motion in the hip that will allow the back to work more efficiently, by being blocked through the hip, you're going to put more pressure on the lower back as well, causing that whole pelvis to dump, having an increase in bend in your lower back. Now the last one, like what we talked about just now, but we're just going to do a revision again. Come and lie on your back. If you're stiff in your Faber's movement, it indicates to us that potentially you're stiff in your pelvis, which you don't have, if you're stiff in your Faber's rather, you don't have any hip extension movement. That means your pelvis is tilted forward, not allowing you to have nice hip extension when you're running. Plus, if your Faber's is different from one side compared to the other side, that gives us an idea about the asymmetry when you're running, compounded from that with a difference potentially in straight leg raise range, you're going to have a difference in movement when you're running as well. So these are three main common endurance activities that we talk about, and how potentially the hips and restriction in the hips can cause problems in these movements. With the hips causing, with the stiffness in the hips, that's going to thus cause problems in the lower back. So rather than hunting around the lower back, we go to the root of the problem, which is actually the hips in this case. All right, what we said at the start, there can be problems upstream in the trunk as well, but for the purposes of this, we're just looking mainly to the hips at the moment and how they can be a cause of pain for, how they can be a cause of problems for lower back pain in endurance activities. All right, so until the next Focus Feature Friday, we'll see you next time.